Now that you understand PowerPoint and know how to create one from scratch, let's now talk about how to use it during a presentation or situation where you're lecturing before a group. If you look at the agenda, you're going to see how it's important to be aware of your body language, movement, and voice when addressing a small or large group. Remember, there are also visuals that are available in addition to PowerPoint, like flip charts and whiteboards. So we'll talk about all of these items in this lecture. So let's start with body language. You need to be aware of your nonverbals. So, for example, looking at your watch as you're speaking, or if a person is asking you a question, looking at your watch can send off mixed signals. Folding your arms, crossing your arms. All right, so when you see something like this while someone is speaking to you, that shows a sign that you're bored or really aren't paying attention. So while you're speaking to someone, try to avoid doing anything like this. What about rolling your eyes? Again, oftentimes if you disagree with a point or with what someone is saying, you may unconsciously roll your eyes. You need to be aware of these things if you're in front of a group speaking. So body language, essentially, these are your nonverbals. You want to maintain eye contact. So that's another thing. Always maintain eye contact with the people you're speaking to. And if you're addressing a large group, you want to maintain balance, which we'll talk about in a different slide. But you also need to pay attention to your hands and arms. Do you talk with your hands? I guess depending on what part of the country or what country you're from, a lot of people have this tendency to talk with their hands, their arms. They become very expressive or animated. Well, in front of a group of people, whether it's students or if you're in the corporate world addressing a group in a conference room, you need to be careful to avoid excessive hand movements as you speak, as they can be really distracting. Again, do not cross your arms while addressing the group, and keep your hands away from your pockets. I don't know how many times I've seen, like, my professors walking around talking to us with their hands in their pockets. It's just unprofessional. It's often viewed that way. Although using just one hand in your pocket is fine. Do not keep both hands in your pocket. I mentioned always maintain eye contact. Now, when it comes to eye contact, you want to avoid staring, because if you're looking at one person for too long, that can be uncomfortable. So you want to look to both sides of the room without looking too shifty. So by that I mean spend about 3 to 5 seconds looking at individuals on both sides of the room as you're speaking. But that way you'll keep things balanced as you address the group as a whole. Again, don't stare at one individual for too long, but try to address both sides of the room equally. And if you're going to stare at a single individual, I don't want to say stare, just spend 3 to 5 seconds, and that's 5 seconds at the most before you move on to the next person. What about movement? When it comes to the business world, oftentimes you're provided with a lectern. You could stand on a podium as you address the audience. Now, a lot of people who are uncomfortable, especially with public speaking, they tend to hide behind the lectern, behind a desk or computer as they're presenting. Do not do that. If you're able to get away from the lectern, oftentimes if you're speaking in front of a big group, they'll provide you with a wireless microphone. For example, last year I was speaking at a big event. I was on stage. There had to be at least 300 people. But they provided me with a wireless mic. So I was able to walk away from the lectern as I addressed the audience. That gives you greater flexibility. And for the bigger events, generally they will provide you with audio type devices like a wireless mic, or even a wired mic with a long extension. This will give you the ability to move around the stage as you speak. This will result in greater engagement with the group. So you want to occasionally move to your left or right. Just don't pace. Again, stay in one spot, speak, move on. Stay in one spot and speak. So left to right. So you want to maintain that balance. Face both left and right sides of the room equally. And if you're carrying a pen or a pencil, be careful not to play with that. So if you have that tendency to fidget, Keep the pens and pencils away from you as you speak. And this should go without saying, but do not chew gum while you're speaking. Not only is that viewed as unprofessional, it'll be picked up on the mic, especially if you're speaking on a mic, the chewing. So that can be very distracting. In this picture, I really like this image because the teacher stepped away from the blackboard, in this case a chalkboard, and the display. He's actually right in front of the group addressing the students. So that's something you want to do and practice. If you're uncomfortable speaking in front of groups, just practice that maybe in front of a smaller group. Okay, what about voice? The big deal here is volume or voice projection. You want to speak loud enough based on group size, or speak to the size of the room, especially if you don't have a microphone. You want to project your voice loudly for larger rooms and then speak clearly, maybe at your normal volume, for smaller conference rooms. But you want to be sure that your voice projection is appropriate to the size of the room or group. I'm hoping that if you're addressing a really large audience, like at trade shows or the professional events, they generally will provide you with a microphone. So that's highly recommended for the larger groups or rooms. And do not be monotone. Lower your voice as needed. Project it well, but don't speak in a monotone way, because you will lose the audience guaranteed if you do that. So again, that will take practice. Now, more on voice. You want to speak clearly and avoid any sort of filler words or trash words, as I like to call them. The big one is the How many times have you heard someone addressing a group and every other word is so, like? Okay, these are all what I call filler or trash words. It's unnecessary. People get uncomfortable with silence, so they'll fill in that void with these trash words. Here's another one, or you know what I mean. Avoid that. Instead, pause momentarily. If you're not sure what to say next, just pause. Think about it before you start speaking. But don't try to fill that silence with these trash or filler words. And also, the nice thing about pausing, that adding this sort of silence can be a great way to engage your group. If you're speaking and all of a sudden you're silent, someone that may not have been paying attention will all of a sudden look up at you. And at that point, you can begin speaking again. So pause. It's okay to be quiet if you're trying to gather your thoughts or collect your thoughts. There's nothing wrong with being silent for a few seconds. All right, we talked about visuals earlier. There may be times where your presentation might involve not just PowerPoint, but also other visual aids like whiteboards and flip charts. Especially if you're in a teaching or classroom environment. In these situations, be sure to avoid excessive writing. By that I mean writing on the board or flip chart with your back turned to the group while speaking. By using these particular visual aids, I've seen it many times from my professors in college. If you are planning on using a whiteboard or flip chart, be sure to write your key points on either aid, whether it's a whiteboard or flip chart, in advance, prior to your presentation, so that when you're speaking, you can just point to the whiteboard or flip chart and then face the audience while you're speaking. Again, avoid turning your back to them. And if possible, provide handouts. Now, there are several different ways of doing this. Remember that if you use notes pages in PowerPoint, you can put detailed notes in that section and then print it out in notes pages if you choose that option, and then that can be used as a handout. Whenever possible, that's the best way to share PowerPoint presentations, if you have detailed notes for each slide. I'm not a big fan of just giving people copies of your slides, because if you design your PowerPoint presentation correctly, there's not going to be much content on the slides. Okay, it's your job as a presenter to elaborate on the bullet points. So look at this slide. If I gave this to you, if I just printed it out, all it would say is whiteboards and flip charts. But everything I discussed, all the salient points were done verbally. And as a presenter, that is your job. With regard to visuals, when presenting your slideshow, I mentioned this already, don't talk to the screen. Don't turn your back to the group. This is often done since your slides are generally projected behind you. When you talk to the screen, your back is turned to the audience and voice projection is compromised. So you want to be interactive, especially in teaching situations where your lecture is on a slide or your key points. To really engage them more, you want to include the group, whether it's a bunch of students or fellow colleagues. Ask overhead or polling questions. They're open-ended. You'll increase engagement this way. And you always want to start your presentation with an agenda slide. As you saw at the beginning of this presentation, it gives everyone an idea of what you're about to discuss or teach them in this case. And you always want to end your presentation with a summary slide where you can quickly review your key points and ideas. So this is a pretty good image of a person who is talking to the screen, and that's very tempting because everyone's looking at it, but you as a presenter should know your content and not need to look behind you as you speak. So avoid talking to the screen. That's what I mean by that. Start with an agenda, end with a summary slide. And here's my summary slide. So remember, with regard to body language, maintain eye contact, always face the group, never turn your back to them while speaking. Pay attention to your nonverbals. The folded arms, looking at your watch, never do that as you're speaking. Voice projection. Here you want to speak to the size of the room, especially if you don't have a microphone. Project your voice loudly for larger rooms and speak clearly at your normal volume for smaller conference rooms. With respect to visuals, if you're using a whiteboard or flip chart, in addition to PowerPoint, pre-write what you'll be discussing on the chart or whiteboard to minimize turning your back to the group. Minimize any text when you're using or creating your PowerPoint slides. Instead, add more images that will drive home your point, and use the slides to augment your message or presentation. Display the picture and elaborate on its meaning, how it ties into your bullet points. People will remember your presentation much better that way if you're using images and that sort of a visual versus a bunch of slides with a lot of text on them. Try to keep it text light and image heavy. So that concludes this lecture. Again, the whole idea is to develop good, solid presentation skills when presenting your slides in PowerPoint.